I think many Western Buddhist converts, came to the religion sort of later as a sort of emerging adult. I personally didn't have even much of a religious or spiritual background. I think that I had, to some extent, a contemplative disposition because I was always deeply interested in questioning. I was very interested in philosophy and religion at a young age, conditioning to lead me in any particular direction, and found myself just gravitating towards Buddhism. That I found that Chinese thought in particular and Buddhism in particular really just resonated with my sensibilities, my worldview. And so in high school, I started, like most students, when they're able to choose their own subjects, becoming more interested in, again, religion, philosophy, and particularly Buddhism. In my bachelor's degree, I ended up majoring in East Asian studies, specializing particularly in China again, because I really resonated with the cultural heritage and philosophy. And then once finishing my studies, ended up moving over to China for about 5 years to really become immersed in the cultural environment, but also to start receiving actually training and the practices and the ritual aspects that I wasn't simply getting from book learning, and which was difficult to access in the United States, at least where I was growing up. Spending 5 years in China was a great experience, but it was also full of conflict. And so the first 2 years, I didn't know anybody, absolutely no one. When I arrived, I just started, like many foreigners, sort of teaching English, in fact, for about a year and a half, and then took about a half a semester also of Chinese. And throughout that whole 2-year period was really, during my weekends and during my summer vacations, my winter vacations, visiting various temples and monasteries, Taoist and Buddhist, in China and the mainland. Also went to Thailand during my more extended vacations to take up insight practice and learn Vipassana, and doing some sitting retreats. I went to Wat Pah Nachat, which is Ajahn Chah's monastery in the north, for about a month during the rains retreat. And then I spent almost 50 days at Wat Chom Thong, which is a much more urban environment. And it's a temple that I was also doing Vipassana practice in, but I was doing it in a much more guided way with the teacher one-on-one. And that was pretty intensive. But at the same time, although at that point I was, again, becoming more deeply understanding of the practices, I still felt this sort of resonance with Chinese heritage. And so it took me about a year to find an organization, which Ed mentioned ended up being Foguangshan, which I felt provided an opportunity, especially for, a white male sort of American interested in seriously studying Buddhism in a Chinese context. And in a context that was socially engaged and modernized in the ways, and progressive in the ways that I was sort of seeking. And so I ended up, after 2 years, moving from China to Taiwan, and then after moving, doing a master's degree in Buddhist studies at Fogang University, which is in Yilan, about an hour outside of Taipei. And that was a very good experience on the whole. One of the reasons why I in particular chose that university, because I went through a whole sort of selection process and entertained options. I even at one point thought about actually initially going to South Africa, because Foguangshan also has a seminary there, which is much more of a sort of monastic training that would allow me to renounce. Instead, I went to a secular university, Fogang University again, which had a seminary. But I chose that not only just to get the degree, but again, to sort of take some of the practices, because there was what they call the sort of semi-monastic curriculum that was part of the education, and all students had to do it. It was a requirement that, for instance, every semester you go on retreat, that there is mandatory sort of volunteer service that you do. Every day there's 5 periods of contemplation that all the students partake in communally. So in the morning we have meditation, and in the evening we have chanting. And then there's 3 periods of contemplation during group meals, and we cook often together, we eat together. A very large percentage of the seminary students were monastics, both men and women. There were, I think, 150 or 60 women and maybe 90 men, and a lot of them were monastics. The majority of the others were Taiwanese. There were a handful of foreign students, but also mostly from the Chinese diaspora. And then there was me and a couple other sort of American white Western Buddhist converts. Anyway, not to make this too long of a story. After Taiwan, I sort of again was interested in extending my graduate education, so I took a year off to apply to graduate schools where I could get a PhD. I ended up in Claremont School of Theology, where I've been for the last 4 years. And again, I just moved like 3-4 days ago from Claremont to Berlin, but I spent the last 4 years getting a PhD in religion. But the concentration I have is in process studies. Process studies that's another conversation, but it's based on the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. And it deeply resonates with Chinese thought, both Taoist and Buddhist especially. I'm very interested in that intersection, but yes, it's shaped my sort of dharmic formation and also my worldview in profound ways. Getting to the sort of context, though, for the meeting that we're sort of building up to in November, I'd say, feeding off of what Ed said, sort of what I've struggled the most with is bringing my whole self to Chinese Heritage Buddhist spaces, because I train within a Chinese Heritage Buddhist organization and continue to do so, and am in many ways committed to doing so. But I also realize that it's increasingly difficult for me to maintain a certain degree of integrity in those spaces, because I realize I'm not bringing my whole self, specifically my socially engaged and activist positions, to those spaces. I often find that I'm code switching when I engage in those spaces, that I'm sort of assimilating and becoming Chinese, which at the beginning was interesting. I sort of wanted to, again, sort of soak up and sort of integrate as much as I could in those environments. It was hard enough as it was, being a white male American trying to learn Buddhism in China and everything that goes along with it. So I just, I was very much interested in assimilating. But after years of doing that, it was increasingly difficult because of the activist commitments that I have around social justice and ecological justice. I'm currently doing work on sustainability. I just felt that those spaces were lacking in the ways that I really wanted to grow spiritually, because I don't see spiritual or political engagement anyway as something separate. And so I think that's in part why I'm engaged with Ed in sort of trying to, what we're calling decolonized Buddhism, because I think that a lot of the intersections, perhaps all of us in this call even share, around social justice, ecological justice issues, and also trying to respect tradition, but at the same time, maybe some people may be interested in innovating or shaping or even assimilating or integrating within their own cultural context, or there's just a whole lot of issues. Ed and I particularly, are sort of at different spectrums. Like he said, sort of Ed was growing up in a very much heritage Buddhist context, but then his spiritual education was Christian, and then he learned Buddhism through English sources, and then he reconnected with heritage Buddhism. And I'm sort of, this American, English-speaking Native American who moved to China and whose initial dharmic formation, and really still today, is very much embedded in Chinese cultural context. And I like that about it. I like the ritual aspects. I like the affective, emotional components of traditional Buddhist practice, but I find that my commitments to decolonization, my commitments to social justice, all of these things aren't often discussed in those circles. And just to sort of mention, not to explain too much, but sort of to mention some of the issues I had around it, I think relate to also the context of the organization in which I was spiritually formed within, because for one, it's a Taiwanese organization, but it's a very modern one. So it's interesting, sort of like what Ed said, it's gone through a sort of modernization process that has taken place for a century, more or less, since the conception of engaged Buddhism in actually Nanjing, sort of near where I was living, by Taishu, and then moving to Taiwan and growing into 4 or 5, depending on how you count, sort of engaged Buddhist organizations over there. Throughout the whole process, it was also learning from the West, learning from Western culture, learning from, science and Christianity in some cases, having Sunday services, there's a lot going on. I hold that. Moving into Chinese cultural spaces and having to assimilate without speaking to the issues I care about has just been difficult. So I think Chinese culture, at least as I've experienced it, is not particularly politically active in the ways that we would conceive it in Western socially engaged Buddhism. It's very engaged in other ways. So I think that's important to name. But it's not politically active in the ways that we would think of BPF sort of on the front lines of a lot of social justice and racial justice issues, which I care a lot about. It's much more sort of respectable. At least the communities that I was involved in, it tends to be middle class and sort of polite. I got really good at, again, sort of code switching and being the white American who speaks Chinese and everybody likes, but at a very superficial level that really became difficult for me to sort of maintain over the long term, because there was a lot in which I felt I wasn't heard, and a lot of my identity that wasn't really resonating with the context in which I was practicing.